Well, Nigel Farage, what an absolute pleasure. You're a man I've wanted to speak with for a very, very long time. And it is a real joy to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Not one bit. And hey, you've been doing great stuff. You're a proper activist. You've been fighting against the big state. And I've spent 30 years fighting the big state. So I think probably, dear boy, I've come to the right place.
Well, look, I really do appreciate you being here. I'm a true activist now, and I have the charge papers to prove it. It's been quite an eventful couple of years. Look, I want to start. You're known as Mr. Brexit. You are the man who went on the Don Quixote noble but hopeless quest of pursuing Brexit, and the popular media predicted doom, gloom. It was going to be horrific. What's the real world outcome of Brexit been from the UK perspective?
We're out. We're free. We're self-governing. We've now got the right to mismanage our own country, or alternatively, alternatively to get it right. I mean, this was the point. You know, this is actually what the globalist order does. It tells you this is about trade. This is about economics. This will make your life better. And please don't worry, your poor little heads. Everything will be just fine. And you discover that actually what it's really all about is taking away power from the people. Why? Well, because the great and the good do not think us, the peasantry, are clever enough or fit enough to make the big decisions about the world. They think they know what is best. And of course, what is best for them is big. What is best for them is unalterable. What is best for them can't be messed up by things like elections, where the shit may be going in one direction and then it changes and goes in another. And so we got lulled as a country half a century ago. We were going through a bad time, a really bad time. Inflation, that's a word we never thought we'd hear again. Inflation was, we've just had our inflation figures this morning. We're now in double digits.
Yeah.
And that's on the CPI measure, not the old RPI measure. So we're actually, because they settled that as well. So we're actually about 12% and rising fast. And I was a businessman. I was working in the commodities business, copper, aluminium, stuff like that. And I began to see legislation affecting what I was doing in my work. And I started to ask the question, where's this come from? And then once I'd asked that question, I asked, well, what can I do to change it? And I realized that once something had become European law, it did not matter if every MP in Parliament voted against it. That was it. We'd succumb to a higher order, a higher priority. So my campaign predominantly was about independence, self-governance, making our own decisions about our own laws, choosing our own friends in the world. And by the way, controlling our own borders, of course, crucially, a subset, but a very important part of that. So I sussed this in about 1990.
Wow.
And by 1992, I realized that there was nobody in either the Conservative or Labour parties, because this wasn't a right or left wing issue.
No.
Democracy is not left or right wing and should never, ever be thought of as such. You know, the British Labour Party actually, in many ways, has always been, over the last 100 years, has been more patriotic in some ways than the Conservative Party.
It could be said, yes.
Until, of course, the new left's come along, which is somewhat different. And I realised there was nobody, frankly, with the guts to stand up and fight this campaign. They might agree in private. No one dared say it. So I just thought, the hell with it. I'm going to speak the unspeakable. I'm going to start putting myself forward for elections. I really don't care if people laugh. If I get nowhere, well, so be it. At least I've tried. And once I'd started, I'll be honest with you, it became an obsession. Just a complete obsession. Sheer bloody mindedness. I mean, that's what I put it down to. But I realised that when I spoke to people in my local pub, in my village in Kent, London is only about 25 miles away, but it could be 5,000 miles away in terms of social attitudes, belief in country, pride. I mean, dare I use that word? Pride.
How dare you?
What our forebears did, and what a lot of Australians there too, in standing up against tyranny at a very great cost. So for me, it was about that. Now we are out, we are free. There are parts of it that haven't been done properly.
Yep.
Northern Ireland finds itself in a difficult position. We haven't fully taken back our territorial waters on fishing rights, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, take the vaccine rollout. Whatever you think of the vaccine, we were able, outside the European Union, to be the first major country in the world to approve a vaccine, to start rolling it out months before the rest of Europe could do it. Take Ukraine. Again, you may well say, well, actually, Boris Johnson's completely gung-ho, over-the-top approach is provoking Putin and could lead to disaster. But as an independent country, not bound by a sort of collegiate spirit, we made our own decisions, we took a firm stand, and arguably gave Western leadership. So we are seeing these things happen. Take the AUKUS deal. The AUKUS deal. I mean, Australia has got rid of a 70-year-old French diesel technology. I mean, if anything was 1950s, it's that. And you've gone for a more modern, sensible approach where your subs can stay submerged and not be subject to Chinese observation. I mean, this stuff's important. We could not have done the AUKUS deal as a member of the EU. So we are striking out. I think we are standing a bit taller in the world in terms of the way people look at us and respect us. That doesn't mean that there isn't tidying up to do, but it's done. It's over. And we now own the status quo, and I rather like that.
Look, I would love to do a slow chat with you, and at some point in the future, fair warning, I've had slow chats with Australian senators that have gone well over 4 hours in duration. I feel like we would probably set a new record, but we don't have that today. So I want to ask a very relevant question for me right now with what I've just gone through and what so many Victorians especially, but Australians generally, but especially Victorians have gone through. Standing up against these sort of supranational powers, the World Economic Forum, the UN, and these various bodies that would like, in the same way that the UN were doing to the UK, they would like to tell you what to do and how to live and so forth. So Brexit was widely viewed as impossible. It was an absolute fool's quest, and I think it's fair to say you were mocked to your face for daring to suggest that it was an achievable outcome. So what are the lessons that you learned? Because we're getting mocked now for standing up to the UN, to the World Economic Forum, to these sorts of elites is a word that I think is overused, but I think it's correct in this context. We're being mocked for that now. So what are the lessons that you learned along the way?
Well, have a thick skin is the first and most important thing. And it's why, of course, the mockery is why, of course, the day after Brexit, in addressing the European Parliament, I said, you all laughed at me. Well, I said, you're not laughing now, or I'd rather reject that. Look, you have to have a very thick skin. Remember that human beings generally find comfort in consensus. To be part of a club where everybody pretty much agrees on where we're going. The only debates are about speed. And frankly, that's what we had with vaccine rollouts, with boosters, with lockdowns. We had a global international mindset. You can call it groupthink, you can call it what you will. And the same happens, whether it's in politics, whether it's in social affairs, whether it's in business, whether it's in science. If you look back over the last 500 or 600 years, where a consensus emerges on something and a challenger, a new idea comes along. I mean, this lunatic Galileo, I mean, can you believe it? Can you believe it? He thought the earth was round. I mean, they put him in prison for it.
Yeah.
Whether it's a Charles Darwin, or whether it's some of the creators of cheap airline flights who took on the established carriers. So it is actually very natural for anyone that comes along and challenges consensus and forms a group of people. It is a natural process to be mocked, abused, derided. There's nothing new in this. Don't think this is suddenly that someone's taken over this group of people. They're behaving as they've always behaved. And it's very important to get that context. So the important thing, how do we fight it? Well, the leaders, the thought leaders of these movements, you being one of them, need a very thick skin. Just don't read what they write about. Don't look at Twitter. I mean, you sort of feel like committing Harry Carey after 20 minutes of that. So you've got to have a thick skin. You've also got to understand that pendulums swing back and forth all through history. Social trends swing back and forth all through history. And I think that we are going to look back at lockdowns as we begin to understand not just the extent to which government just took away our liberty and our freedom, and Victoria being a particularly egregious example of that, but also the harm that lockdowns have caused, whether it's the impaired development of children, whether it's the elderly being isolated and sent into a sort of downward spiral of depression, or in a UK case, and this is shocking, we now have 300,000 people with diagnosed cancers awaiting treatment because we just put the whole thing on hold.
Yeah.
We just put the whole thing on hold.
And now, of course, the system.
So what we're going to see is a much higher death toll over the course of the next 2 or 3 years that will exceed in numbers, way exceed in numbers, anyone that died. And I won't say of coronavirus, I'll say with coronavirus, which I think is a very important distinction. And I think people will wake up to this. I mean, they were scared. They were scared. We were all a bit scared to begin with. This was something new. We didn't understand its potency. We saw the pictures of those hospital corridors in Milano. We thought, crikey, I mean, this is very, very scary. But government kept that fear going. And in the end, they promoted it on a lie. And the lie was, unless you get jabbed often, repeatedly, you're going to kill your granny. I mean, that is what they told us.
You're not wrong.
We had government adverts in Britain on radio and television, government-sponsored, huge money. And the theme of the advert was a picture of an old person and can you look into their eyes? Can you, as an individual, how dare you go and see them or speak to them if you've not had your jabs and had your booster and all the rest of it? And what we have learned is it is probably right to say that if you had a couple of jabs and got COVID, you'd be less ill. That is probably the right thing to say. But what is absolutely not the right thing to say is by having the jab, you couldn't catch COVID. That's absolutely for the birds. And some of the evidence now is once you've had the third or fourth jab, you might be even more likely in some ways to get it. But the key to this is the fear, the drive to be jabbed, the arresting of Novak Djokovic. I mean, what can you say? I mean,
I'm embarrassed.
Who thought Australia would turn back into a penal colony? I mean, just extraordinary.
Okay.
And all of this based on, unless you had, if you had the jab, you couldn't pass on COVID. And we now know that that's not true. We now know that's not true. So I think you'll find with what you've been doing and the rough time that you've been given for it, I think you'll find over time, people saying, Topher, you know what, mate, I wasn't sure at the time, but I think you were right.
It's already happening. Now, you're coming to Australia. You're going to be speaking in Melbourne, in Sydney, in Brisbane. Can you give us a hint? What is the message that you're bringing to Australia?
What is so fascinating is the advanced English-speaking countries, and I'm talking predominantly America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom. The five of us, the Five Eyes, countries that share intelligence, countries that share, hey, look at the music, look at the film.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I mean, you can't believe people crying in Britain because Neighbours has finished. I mean, so we do.
We're not crying over here, I can tell you that.
But we have a very interesting shared culture, okay? And when I get off the plane in Melbourne in 3 or 4 weeks' time, it won't feel like a foreign country. And if you come to London, it doesn't really, I mean, it's different, but it's not foreign.
Yeah.
And what fascinates me is that through my work with Brexit, through my work with President Trump in America, through my previous visits to Australia, I've noticed something, and it's clearer now than it's ever been, and it's this. The threats we face, both external and internal, are virtually identical. We may have different players, we may have different electoral systems, we may have different priorities, but the threats are exactly the same. The external threat, the massive underestimation of what President Xi has done to China, and much of that willful. by people making a great deal of money off the back of the expansion of the Chinese economy. But how we deal with that is a common problem right across the Western world, right across the English-speaking world. And the internal threats, and by this I mean the threats to free speech, the poisoning of our children's minds at school and then right through to university. The fact we've stopped teaching critical thinking, that we're telling our youngsters one side of an argument is virtuous, the other is evil. Even the attempts to break down the Judeo-Christian base upon which all of our constitutional settlements were made, belief in family, some very strange ideas about gender and biology. I won't elaborate.
Careful, you'll get me cancelled. Careful.
but we're not able to have rational debates about this. And what we learn is that actually a very active, well-funded minority is able to dominate our national debates. The folk outside the capital cities of all of our countries do not agree with any of this baloney. They just don't. And yet, and here's the problem, and here's why I'm coming. It's very easy to blame the loony left. Very easy to blame George Soros or whatever we like. Actually, what we ought to be doing is looking in the mirror. It's our fault. It's the fault of the conservative movements and conservative politicians who have been utterly gutless, taken over by a bunch of careerists, masquerading at elections that they're really conservative in values and governing, frankly, way to the left of that. And the big moral of the story, and I can show you, not just through Brexit, but through Johnson's massive majority in 2019, that when conservative-minded parties start being conservative, the most remarkable thing happens. Do you know what happens? They win elections.
Yeah.
They win elections.
That's amazing, isn't it?
And the Australian Liberal Party has really since 2015, and you can totally go to hell if you like, but I'm just observing this. The Australian Liberal Party since 2015 has made a series of catastrophic errors. Why? Because the people who pick the leader of the party are the representatives in Canberra, who of course are part of that metropolitan elite bubble. The fact that actually members of the Australian Liberal Party don't get to choose who is actually the leader. And you've had a succession of leaders who've taken the party to the left, frankly been almost indistinguishable from Labour on many of the big issues, who went for lockdown, I mean, just in a way that is almost unimaginable for anyone that believes in, as the Americans would say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's rather a great phrase. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying there is a commonality of struggle. I've watched this in Britain. I've watched this in America. It's our fault. We've been gutless. But actually, it's time for the grassroots, to use a phrase from Brexit, to take back control. You've got to take back control of the conservative thought movement in Australia. And you've got to do that, and you've got to make sure you're represented by better people who are more robust about defending the values that the majority of us believe in so passionately. And I really hope that crossover of ideas is one that is understood by the audiences I speak to.
Look, we've already gone past the clock, but I'm going to just keep on with the last question here. Melbourne, as you know, was the site of the worst of the lockdowns, harsher, deeper than anywhere outside of China. And to your point earlier, I've got a quote here from Clive James, who once quipped, "The problem with Australians is not that so many of them are descended from convicts, but that so many are descended from prison officers." And you made that observation just a moment ago. There is something in our psyche that allowed this to happen here. Is there something, as an outsider looking in, can you see something that perhaps it's harder for us to see, or is this?
It's a difficult one. I mean, as I say, the big picture issues are exactly the same. But I do think Australia has taken the idea of big government and control and threatening people to the most extraordinary degree. I mean, a good example is cigarettes. Now, they're very bad for you.
Yes.
I wouldn't recommend them.
Nope.
The Australian attitude towards the taxing of cigarettes, Australia's just taken these things further, I think, than the rest of us have. And I guess when you start to condition a society into believing that government knows best, then it actually made lockdowns in Melbourne and places like that much easier to put in place.
Yeah.
And again, that's part of the thought process that the Liberal Party needs to go through, or activists need to go through. Mrs. Thatcher, when she was elected in 1979, said she would reverse the move towards government controlling everything. And everyone said it's too difficult, it's too hard.
Can't be done.
It was kind of a late 70s version of draining the swamp, if you like. And do you know what? She did it. And the Republican Party in America, which post-war, post-1945, had gone down very similar routes to the Democrats, with support of big globalist organizations, ever more centralized control of power, more things being decided in America at a federal level than at a state level. And this fellow called Ronnie Reagan turned up. And he said, what are the most depressing 8 words in the English language?
I'm
here from government, and I've come to help you.
Yes.
And the idea being, and actually, a final thought, if I may, on economics.
Sure.
Because I think this feeds through into economics. The left criticized capitalism, the failure of capitalism. Please do not think we're living in capitalism. We are not living in capitalism.
Agreed.
We are living in global corporatism. We are living in our societies where big banks, big multinational companies, and big politics come together, set as tight a regulatory framework as they can to stop small and medium-sized competitors coming in and challenging. And maybe economics could be a useful way for all conservative movements to understand that government has overreached too far. We need to free up men and women to go out and take risks, to get engaged in genuine free enterprise. We're going to stop handicapping people from doing these things. And there's always a good reason for making a new law. You know, it's health, safety, the environment, you know, it's motherhood, it's save the planet. I mean, it's all this stuff. But actually, this is a trend that needs to be reversed. So in some ways, you're quite right. Australia's got this worse than we have in Britain or America. New Zealand, Canada, no. I mean, they're in a bad place.
The less said about New Zealand, the better.
Yeah, but actually, the logical argument as to why reversing this can lead to greater wealth, why reversing this can lead to greater freedom, that we've got to get, as I say, Thatcher came from nowhere and did it. Reagan came from nowhere and did it. Trump, working with Republican governors, put the most astonishing supply-side reforms into place. I mean, states like Georgia, have been growing at over 4% for the last 5 years, and doing it by freeing people up, by getting excessive taxes and excessive regulation off the backs of people. And we frankly, in your Liberal Party and our Conservative Party, we've had virtually no one in the last few years that has understood the principles that actually have led to greater wealth, and why our traditional way of doing things, is better than state socialism.
Nigel Farage, this has been an absolute thrill for me. Now, with all of that spare time that you obviously have, you're a man of leisure. We can all see that. How I assume, of course, you've prioritised and found time to watch Battleground Melbourne at some point in time.
Absolutely, no question about that. Absolutely, yes. And I have to tell you,
I'm sorry. Are you actually being serious? You have actually watched it?
I've watched it, and I'm actually no, of course, proud of this. I have, and I
wow.
It is very difficult. It's very difficult to believe that we've got to this place. Very difficult to believe that a civilized city like Melbourne has allowed this to happen. And we need a peaceful counter-revolution. That's what we need.
Well, I don't know what to say, Nigel. That was a joke question in the full expectation that you would not have seen it. That's actually amazing. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
I do my homework.
Fair enough. Now, we can see you, or we will see you, and I'll be there in Melbourne on the 26th of September, Sydney on the 27th, Brisbane on the 29th. Tickets are at nigelive.com.au. I'll put the link on the screen. And I'll also see you at CPAC. I'm speaking on the Sunday afternoon, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say at CPAC as well. And for those that haven't seen Battleground Melbourne, battlegroundmelbourne.com. Nigel Farage, what a pleasure. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to Australia. I look forward to shaking your hand when you're here.
Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.